Well, welcome everyone to our third annual legislative lunch meeting. Sometimes these are breakfasts. Today it's a lunch. I'm really happy you could all make this. My name is Jim Schwallen. I'm Vice President of Marketing and Personal Lines here at West Bend, so we are happy to host you all in our facility. We're always happy to host these types of events, and I'm also currently honored to be the President of the Threshold Board. And I do have some folks that I'd like to introduce. Before I do that, though, I just want to say it's a great opportunity for us to get together and hear about some of the issues that we face as an organization and other organizations like ours face. Hopefully a learning opportunity for all of us today. So thanks for coming. I'd like to introduce some of our board members as well. And I'm going to just call off the names of our board members and foundation members, and if you could stand up. I'd like to honor the service that you provide for our organization. Randy Averill, John Biesper, John Conwell, Jim Fackelman, Sue Garman, Andrea Caney, Dave Lefebvre, Amy Salzberg, Sarah Snyder, Gail Steiner, and Phil Sutter. And nobody wanted to remain standing, but thank you. If I missed anybody, I'm sorry. Please stand up and we'll applaud for you as well. No, thank you for all the time, the personal time you put in and dedication and your volunteer hours to this organization. Very much appreciated. And two, I also want to recognize that we have some of our elected officials and representatives here today, and I just would like to introduce them as well. We have, starting on the left, Bob Gannon representing Slinger. We have Representative Jesse Kramer from Kewaskum, Senator Dewey Strobel, and Ginger Colemansberger representing Senator Ron Johnson's office, and Dan Knoll representing Germantown. So thank you to all of you. And did I forget? I did forget one. We have Benjamin Juarez as well, representing Tammy Baldwin's office. So again, thank you for all of our elected officials coming today. We really appreciate your time for this event. And then I would like to introduce John Bloor, our Executive Director for the Threshold. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Jim. I just have a couple other people I'd like to introduce before we get into the program. We have Scott Hankey, who's the Executive Director of the Hartford Chamber of Commerce. And we have Lynn Gergich, who's the Executive Director of the Germantown Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for coming. Our first speaker today is Lincoln Burr, and he's the Executive Director of Rehabilitation for Wisconsin. Rehabilitation for Wisconsin has been representing community-based rehabilitation programs for over 50 years. Link's been working in the field for over 20 years. He's provided leadership in community rehabilitation programs, supportive employment agencies, multiple day programs, and a company that provided community-based residential services to over 500 people. So Lincoln.
Thank you, John. John asked me to talk a little bit about Wisconsin today. Terry's going to be following up with what's happening nationally. It is a dynamic time that we're in right now, unprecedented in the 20 years I've been doing this. So if I wanted to summarize what's happening in Wisconsin, the word would be uncertainty. I want to start with a little bit of background about special minimum wages, because that's become a hot topic. And it ties in with a lot of the things you're going to hear from both Terry and from me. In Wisconsin today, about 9,600 people are earning what's called a special minimum wage. It essentially is pay for performance, which I'm sure the folks in this building know very well. In the insurance industry, I worked in that for a short time, and my pay and my performance didn't pay me enough to keep going. So it's a hard way to earn a living, I'll grant you that. But the idea of it is, if you have somebody making $15 an hour making widgets, and they can do 150 widgets in that hour, if someone else is doing 50 widgets, then they're going to get $5 an hour. And the idea behind it and why it's allowed and why it's endorsed by the Department of Labor is that They're looking at it as an opportunity for people to gain skills, to get work experience, to discover what they like, what they're good at, and to have an opportunity, if they're interested, to move into a community integrated employment position. Special minimum wage certificate allows employers to focus more on what people are good at and less on what they're not good at, which might have to do and be related to speed. It's a tool that a lot of community-based agencies use to provide a safe and nurturing environment, somewhere where people want to go and create a group of cohorts and get some experience and enjoy what they do. Nearly 80% of people with disabilities nationally don't participate in the workforce, which is just a remarkable number. And the reason is because the market doesn't create opportunities for them. So as we talk about all of these ideas of shifting where people work, while a lot of it is very positive, and we certainly should be embracing the opportunity for everybody to have embracing the idea that everybody should always have the opportunity to work in the community, the challenge is those jobs don't necessarily exist. As we improve technology, as we improve the way that we support people, more and more of those jobs will exist. But our fear, of course, is that this won't be done in a very thoughtful and logical way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's kind of a fundamental right in my mind that people can work where they choose to work, and that's what we're really fighting for. There's 3,400 employers nationally that use special minimum wages, and they employ 420,000 people. So this is a massive program, and we're talking about a lot of people who are going to be affected by whatever decisions are made by the federal government with regard to this topic. Many of those folks, or those 420,000, probably wouldn't be in the workforce if it weren't for a special minimum wage. Economics, being nonpartisan, usually wins out when it comes down to it. And if somebody's working at a quarter of the pace, it's very difficult to find an employer who's willing to give them a chance. The other concern that we have when we talk about this is that community rehabilitation programs provide much more than simply work opportunities at special minimum wages. They provide support throughout the day. They provide support for people that is very informal in a lot of ways. If Jim comes in and he seems a little bit off today, someone's going to say, you know, you don't seem quite like yourself, Jim. And these are oftentimes, John and his staff are the people who know Jim the best because they've spent 15 years talking with Jim and they know him. And when they see those things happening, they pick up the phone and they make sure that everything is okay. Those are the kind of informal supports that help people stay out of institutions, that help people stay out of the hospital. You know, you wouldn't believe the stories I've heard of things that we've discovered. I have a woman who needed some support during the day when she was using the bathroom, started having some spotting between her cycles, and the staff identified it, got a doctor involved, and found out she had ovarian cancer. That wouldn't have been caught if they hadn't known her very personally, very intimately. And those are the kinds of things that we risk losing. We also risk losing the backstop. You know, people who work in the community, many of the people we work with straddle working in the community and working at a place like the Threshold. When those jobs in the community don't work out, when something goes wrong, oftentimes they'll come back to the Threshold or come back to the Threshold full-time until they can get back out into the community. Without an organization like the Threshold, that's not possible. Threshold and all of the other organizations like it also provide a lot of transportation. And oftentimes, sadly, if it weren't for the Threshold, those people couldn't have jobs in the community because they wouldn't have a ride to the job, especially in rural Wisconsin where we've got people traveling 30 or 40 miles in order to find their employment at Culver's. That isn't going to economically work out if they have to try to buy a car and drive. So these are organizations that are very robust. They provide a lot of services that I think are kind of behind the scenes that people don't even realize are happening. So in talking about some of the things that are happening in Wisconsin, probably the most dynamic Wisconsin-based thing that's happening is what's called Act 55. That was part of the budget that was passed last year. And it definitely will change the landscape of services for people with disabilities in Wisconsin. It creates something called Integrated Health Agencies, or IHAs. Wisconsin has historically had a system that was based on counties. So We had 72 counties, we had 72 systems. And there were some wonderful things about that, and there were some things that weren't so good, and that's why we went to the system we're in now. What was beautiful about the county-based system is that the people who were working and supporting in a care management role for Jim knew Jim extremely well. County employees, long-term employees, people who are going to be here for 15 or 20 years, they knew everything about Jim, and they were an advocate. I mean, a rabid advocate in many cases, and it was wonderful to see. And Jim was going to get everything Jim could get. That gave way to the MCO model where we are today, family care. And the idea of family care was that we wanted a more unified system across the entire state. We wanted to see everybody get the same benefit package across the state. And there were big differences in the county system. Dane County spent lavishly. Marinette County didn't put in $1 of match. So is it fair to the guy in Marinette County? You know, he obviously should be moving to Dane. That was the argument. The challenge with family care was the MCOs are much bigger than the county-based system. We went from 72 to just a handful. And of course, they didn't know folks as well. And they didn't have the benefit of county employees who are going to be there for 15 or 20 or 30 years. They had people who were getting out of college, getting a job, getting to know Jim, and oftentimes would walk in and say, which one's Jim? Obviously, that's not quite the same quality of care management. So, and I don't want to indict the system. I think they've done a good job of rectifying a lot of that and gotten a lot closer to the goal of what we really want, which is a much more intimate knowledge of Jim so we can make sure he's getting person-centered planning in the way that it's designed to be. The idea of Act 55, which will make this even broader, is that it's going to integrate primary and acute care with long-term care. So what I'm saying is before, long-term care was funded by family care, whereas primary and acute care was funded by Medicaid. So that separation arguably cost money, and it cost money in a few ways. First of all, we weren't treating the whole person. This is the state's argument for putting this in place. We weren't treating the whole person, we were treating a segment of that person. This is their long-term care, this is the primary, this is acute. And it makes some sense when you think about whether or not it would save money. If you're running a residential facility or even a place like the Threshold and you go to the park and someone gets a sunburn, if John gets a sunburn, he's going to go home and rub something on it. If somebody with a disability gets a sunburn, John's probably going to have them go to the ER because there's a lot of liability. There's liability in the form of sanctions by the state. There's liability in form of having a reputation besmirched by getting citations. There's liability from a legal perspective. Obviously, people sue. So the ER is a backstop largely. It's a go-to. Now imagine if whoever's funding John is also funding the ER. There's probably going to be a new solution that's come up with besides spending $4,000 to get the sunburn looked at. So there is some logic to this, and I know that people are afraid of change, and I certainly can appreciate that. We fear it as we see all of the changes coming down the road, and but at the same time, I see the efficacy behind the idea of that potentially saving money. Another great example is facilities are often asked with people who are more medically fragile to transfer them every 2 hours or less because of pressure sores. Pressure sores are enormously expensive to treat. If the organizations are incentivized or penalized as a result of somebody getting a pressure sore, you can imagine that the outcomes will be better for the person with a disability, the outcomes will be less expensive. It's quite possible, I would imagine, that an IHA is going to hold John accountable if somebody gets a pressure sore because they weren't transferred for 4.5 hours instead of 2. So you can see where this could help bend that cost curve a bit. There's also going to be an increased focus on folks identifying challenges early on. The fear that the state has, which is a legitimate fear, is that a tremendous number of new entrants to the system is going to crush it financially. And we're not talking about people with disabilities, we're talking about more on the elderly side. The baby boomers are aging, you've all heard that a million times. Well, they're going to be entering this system, and how are we going to contain costs within that system when the number of people is growing so dramatically and so quickly? If you ask what we think of the new approach, I'll just say we don't know. There's just not enough information. The department just a few days ago submitted to Joint Finance their update, and it said that they've had a lot of listening sessions, a lot more than they were required to have, which of course we're very excited to see. They're getting a lot of input. I'm hoping that they'll really take it to heart, and I expect that they will. And on April 1st, they're going to be submitting their draft plan to Joint Finance. Joint Finance has to approve whatever plan they come up with, so that'll be a lot of late nights of reading probably, because I'm guessing it won't be a short plan. But it'll give us a really good idea of what we're really looking at, and what's going to be great and what's going to be not so great about it. The rest of the stuff I'm going to talk about is going to be brief, but it's about it because the stuff Terry's going to touch on too. But what's happening at a federal level is a lot of rulemaking for the most part, and those rules are then interpreted by the states. So as an example, one of the new rules is the home and community-based service setting rule, and it's going to talk about anything that's funded by federal dollars has to be in the most integrated setting possible. And that's something that we've done in Wisconsin forever. Chapter 55 demanded that for many years, that everybody be in the most integrated setting possible. Now, whether or not the HCBS rules are interpreted as simply the least or most integrated setting, or if they are taken to a new level, is what we're a bit concerned about. The rulemaking behind these rules is thousands of pages in many cases, and what interpretation the state comes up with based on those, we don't know. The state's been very open and very good at listening to what we have to say. They've invited us to the table. They've had us help design the measurement tool. We're very happy about that. What they're doing now is collecting the data based on that tool, and then they're going to talk to us again about, okay, what's it all mean? What we are concerned about with that rule is the interpretations. One of the things that the feds put into the rule was that, as an example of integrated settings, settings are integrated based upon the work experience. So, Goodwill, if you have, let's say, 30 people working at a Goodwill and 15 of them have a disability, 5 of them are supervisors, they're working in a store selling product to the general public, is that an integrated setting? I think most people would go, of course it is. They're working in a store and they're selling product to people. The federal government's not so sure. They're a little bit concerned that that would not be integrated because the people you're working with are not non-disabled. So they still see it as segregating. Now, whether or not that stands, whether or not that's the way it's enforced, we don't know that yet. But that would be one of the examples that we're concerned about. Another one is the way stations in Wisconsin, the roadside facilities that you stop to use the bathroom. All of those are maintained by people with disabilities. It's the exact same scenario. Most of the people working, cleaning those, these are great jobs. They're all paying above minimum wage. These people are maintaining the lawns, they're cutting the shrubs, they're cleaning, they're maintaining everything about those facilities. It's a great job and a great learning opportunity, but is it integrated? They spend every day, all day with people who have disabilities, but the federal government's saying, we're not so sure. So those are some of the things we're a little concerned about that we're up against. Another thing we're looking at is something called WIOA, or the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. It was passed in July of 14. It is a new law, but by April of 15, the administration had released 2,600 pages of guidance based on just a few new lines. There's some good things in it. There's some good performance measures that I think are really positive, and there's some good things for youth age 14 to 24. They're using something called the kick in the pants provision, which is saying, we want you to try working in the community, and that's a pretty positive thing. Give it a try. The challenge will be how long they have to try before they can say, I kind of want to try something else because this isn't working well. And that, there are some rules around that, but right now we're not sure again how that'll be necessarily interpreted. Until they try several times and fail, they won't be allowed to work in a facility that pays special minimum wage. As I say, though, much of WIOA is good, and there are it's just some of the concerns will be related to how it ends up being interpreted. We're also tracking something called the Advisory Committee on Increasing Competitive Integrated Employment for Individuals with Disabilities. Challenge any one of you to say the name of that committee right now. Only the feds could come up with something that long. They have been hostile toward our business since the inception of the committee, and we expect them to come out with recommendations to eliminate 14C entirely. They were chartered by the Department of Labor, so again, we don't know whether the recommendations will be adopted and in what manner, but these are all threats about whether we can continue to do business, at least somewhat similar to the way that we have been doing it. We're certainly entering a new space and time, something that we haven't seen before. And I can't say that this is an accurate assessment, but this is my feeling. 20 years ago when I started in this industry, it felt like 80% of the rules were coming from the county. You know, maybe 15% were coming from the state. They had a broad oversight role, and then like 5% from the feds. You never really heard about the feds, and we've turned that upside down. So the federal government is controlling a tremendous amount more of what's going to happen here at a local level. And my concern with that, I understand there are positives about it, but obviously my concern about that is the same thing as when we transitioned from the county to the MCO. Local control and local knowledge of the people that we're talking about is what makes these things successful. And, you know, the federal government, as an example, many years ago was opening institutions simultaneously with organizations like the Threshold opening. So while parents were saying, you know, we need something community integrated, we need to open up something where people can go and work during the day. The federal government was, or in the states were going, you know what we should do? We should open some big old institutions. And we put like 1,000 people in there and no one will bother them. Won't that be great? So, I mean, they've not necessarily figured out what needs to happen nearly as well as the parents and the people on the ground have figured it out. That's kind of the history of this whole industry, is if you listen to people locally, you get some great ideas. Our job at RFW is obviously to continue trying to work as the voice of organizations like the Threshold at a state level. Terry will talk about what he does, which is the exact same thing but at a federal level. And again, a lot of what's happening is coming from that federal level. You know, we've heard a lot over the last few years about the soft bigotry of low expectations. I'd ask you to consider whether there's any more bigoted thought and more low expectation than somebody not being able to decide where they want to work and taking that choice away. So with that, I would like to introduce Terry Farmer. Terry and I have worked together for a number of years. I highly recommend him. I consider him a friend. And Terry holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Johnson College, University of Redlands, and a master of public administration from Florida State University. He is an honorably discharged United States Air Force veteran. His extensive work experience includes positions in direct care, behavioral analysis, program administration, executive management, and policy analysis in the field of disabilities and human services. He's administered programs of residential care and treatment, diagnosis and evaluation, and community placement of people with severe developmental disabilities and mental illness. He's worked in public institutions, community development, and positions of state policy and client programs in Florida since 1975. Terry accepted a position with the Florida Association of Rehab Facilities in 1990 and was appointed president and CEO of the statewide Public Education and Trade Association in 91. He served in that capacity through December of 2008. He's been affiliated with several state and national professional organizations and has been recognized for his academic work and service to the field. In January of 2009, he helped found and create Combat Injuries Project, or CIP, located in Tallahassee, Florida. With a group of veterans, professionals, and business executives, CIP was formed as a nonprofit organization dedicated to serve veterans, especially those with service-connected disabilities, as well as their families. Terry accepted the position of ACCESS CEO in April of 2011. ACCESS represents more than 1,200 disability service providers across the country as the voice of disability service providers. ACCESS works to promote and enhance community-based solutions that maximize employment and living opportunities for people with disabilities through collaboration with government and other stakeholders to ensure that services recognize and support the full potential of each person with a disability to enjoy a meaningful life. So with that, I introduce Terry.
Thank you very much, Link. I'm very pleased and had the pleasure of meeting some of your representatives, your elected officials, and their representatives today. That's a super sign that community organizations, the families and individuals that they support, are in direct communication with their elected officials. And we just need to do a lot more of it in our particular field. I'm also gratified. I was in the upper part of your state earlier today in the home of the Packers, near Lambeau Field, Vince Lombardi land, and the tremendous athletes produced out of Wisconsin over the years. My dad's side of the family are Texas Cowboys. So when they lost their property to the banks during the Dust Bowl years and moved with many others to the West Coast and settled in California, where I was born and raised, when we watched football in the 50s and 60s, we were supporters of the Dallas Cowboys. And eventually we became supporters of the Los Angeles Rams. And I can remember in my youth going to the Grand Coliseum in LA and later to the Rose Bowl to watch the college teams play. And what a fantastic experience that was. But during football season, my dad wanted so much and could not wait for the Snow Bowls. And Midwestern football was at its height, really, as I was growing up. And we would turn on that 3-channel black and white television and watch some of the greatest football. And you still are producing great football and great players. So we rooted for the Cowboys and the Rams, but man, we loved watching your teams compete here in the Midwestern country. So it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for having me. So we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with federal policy. And basically we ask the question, will the emerging disability policy framework support a full array of options and opportunities for individuals with the most significant disabilities? And as Link so well articulated, we're not sure. We really aren't sure, and we see some signs that make us very, very nervous. And in fact, we've seen some outcomes in Wisconsin where services have been reduced. And we've seen in other states that when we eliminate options and opportunities, that people fall back into the cracks and lose services. But I think the answer is yes. Although we're currently in a raging storm of criticism, policy change, intense scrutiny, we can create a brighter future if we unite with those who share our beliefs and values, embrace a common goal, strategy, and message, and combine our resources to answer the naysayers and achieve the vision of the future that we embrace. We kind of lost our spirit for the building years that we had when we were graced with some additional funding to service systems. And we lost track of policy change, particularly on the federal level. And as a community of supporters of people with significant disabilities, we got to the business and task of building our programs and our community capacity at the local level, at the state level. And in doing so, we fragmented so that when the federal sea change began, we weren't prepared to have a voice in national policy. And we're behind the curve now. So reunification of a common voice with those that believe the same thing we do is critical to our future. So that's a condition of achieving the brighter future. We've got to unify nationally with a common voice. And we got to tell the story that one size does not fit all, that people need options. And we here in America believe that choice, independence, charting our own future is fundamental to the American dream. And you can't pigeonhole millions of Americans into one box like the federal government at times seems to be trying to do. And it's particularly acute within the disability community, which is so diverse and heterogeneous. There are different people with different needs, and they need to have options and a variety of opportunities, and they need to be empowered to choose their own course. Options and choice are critical, and we're seeing federal policy close that down and eliminate things that people want and need. And we got to tell the story about our community organizations. We are family, community-built organizations to help ourselves keep our loved ones out of public institutions, out of jails, out of prisons, inappropriately placed in mental health institutions if they don't have a behavioral health need. And we are a tremendous and critical resource in our communities. We need to be embraced, not battered, by those that are denigrating the work that we do, pigeonholing us into, we only provide one option for people, and that's to chain them to a workstation and pay them measly wages, nothing at all. We are a vast resource to support people and families in our communities. We contribute tremendous economic support to our local communities with the jobs that we create, with the business as entrepreneurs that we generate. So we need to be supported, not beaten. It is an incredible time of change. The term economic new normal has arisen in the last 5 years since the Great Recession. Technological advances, they never seem to stop, coming more quickly. Demographic shifts. We're getting older as a population. People with disabilities, because of our medical advances in technology, are living longer, more healthier years. Political dynamics have been the most contentious in my lifetime in the last 15 to 20 years. And public policy and funding changes have come at us at a more rapid rate. Link quoted his 20 or so years of experience. This will be telling my age, but in my 40 or so years of experience, I have never seen this tidal wave of change coming down from the federal level, from a very activist administration. So we're pushing for change. So what's the countervalence to the push for change, for progress? Growing waiting lists, the demand is increasing. Aging brings more costs, service needs, pressure on the system. That labor policy changes, increasing minimum wage, doing away with special minimum wage, making sure that people get paid a full days of wages, even in their off time. We're seeing this come out of the Department of Labor and its regulatory changes, and from the administration and executive orders. The need for new technology, we now are dependent on technology. How many of us remember that what was technology in the old days? Well, we had a TV set, we had a radio, and we had a hardline telephone. And then we had pencil and paper. And some of us still used a block of granite. But that was our technology. Now it's just all around us, everywhere, and the new advances are coming out faster than ever. And there is pressure to finance more expensive services. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So in a period when we have a greater demand for services, there's also this pressure for more expensive services. And it's not only on the medical IT side, it's also in the field of serving people particularly those with significant disabilities. And at the same time, funding and budgets are getting tighter. The jobs of our elected officials are tremendously stressed by the demand side and then the fiscal, the revenue side, the ability to have enough resource to meet the need. And what a terrible position to be in that they are taken care of on our behalf. And we don't envy you that at all. We understand it. So even though I believe the future is brighter, if we make it brighter, there are definitely bumps in the road, and we are in some valleys right now, and we got some mountains yet to climb. And they can at times frustrate and make us very fearful. And we understand, though we don't like it, change is inevitable, except from a vending machine. It can make us angry. The drivers of change, the advocates, policymakers who are driving change based upon the forces that are in our environment, whether they're well-meaning or mean-spirited, can be enraging. So I call upon here my friend Jack to express how I and we feel when we just can't take it anymore. He says it so well, doesn't he? So what are some of the current issues we face? Ideology and civil rights. Since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the advancement in disability rights has been emerging. And we have been under, over the last 7 years, the most recent push of disability advocacy for civil rights. And that ideology can be summed up with everybody needs to have the same opportunities, be treated the same, and be included in the community, as is everybody else. That sums it up. So a lot of the push to change for community inclusion, et cetera, is based upon the ideology and is cast as a civil rights issue, which does resonate with many policymakers. Population growth we've talked about, increasing demand for services, so we're introducing funding constraints, including managed care, which you're in the middle of experiencing. Wisconsin always seems to be on the bleeding edge of some of these policy changes. So along with your football, you do a great job kind of leading at the front of the curve. But we also have tremendous internal competition. There are disability consumers who are pitted against other disability consumers. Who are the haves, the traditional haves? Where's the largest growth and highest cost gone? People with the most significant disabilities, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. When you look at the costs as a bean counter on a spreadsheet, the cost for residential service and day service is a huge block of money compared to what, on a proportional basis, people with physical disabilities might receive through the federal funding scheme, which includes, on a large part, Medicaid. So the people with the smaller piece of pie want a bigger piece of pie. The people with the biggest piece of pie are the targets for a smaller piece of pie. So there's definitely consumer competition and consumer-driven advocacy targeted at who we serve. Provider competition. ACCSES, and I respect and have supported that movement since the early years, but ACCSES is a provider group who is amongst the advocates advocating very strongly to eliminate some congregate options, whether it's residential or employment, but particularly in the employment arena. So here's a provider group bedamning another provider group And we also have business competition, Ability One and state use. We're taking, in the words of the small business community, their work from them through preferred purchasing programs. So we have that business side of it. So I raised this question just for us to think about. When we follow the money, who will gain from change? To understand where some of this force, this pressure to change is coming from. And I submit, I deeply respect, I understand these positions, but these are the key groups out of many who are pressing to eliminate what I think are very important options and opportunities for individuals and their families, like center-based home care, center-based day services, and employment. These are the top groups that are pushing, lobbying every day, and putting in tremendous media scrutiny to us and what we do, and casting dispersions on our work. We're the exploiters. We're the folks that are hurting people. But where might some of this be coming from? Well, if the preferred source programs, Ability One and state use programs, are blown up, some of these other groups will benefit because they have some preferred status already in federal law. So they'll get more business. Provider groups in this list, if another provider group is blown up, have the opportunity for more business. And there are also labor issues involved. And you can see that the labor movement is also really interested in who we are, what we do, and the folks that we employ. So just food for thought. Follow the money, and you can usually understand some of the dynamics. And the media blitz, which I already referred to. I'm going to go into some more detail on this, but the proponents to eliminate options and opportunities have been very successful in using the right buzzwords to get the attention of the media and then just hammering us and what we do. And let them hammer us. But the fallout is on the individuals that we serve and their families. And that we need to stand up and fight. So what are some of the current policy changes? Elimination of special minimum wage. The bill currently sits in subcommittee, and it's up to us to make sure it continues to sit in subcommittee. Transition to Independence Act. This is a good measure to provide incentive in the Medicaid program to move towards community integration, community inclusion. But in its present state, it bashes and eliminates some options and opportunities which we continue to support, like special minimum wage. Opportunities for those who need and want it. So we're working with the Senator and Congress to improve this good bill. Section 14C enforcement. There's more money in that pot for enforcement. There's some new kids on the block doing the audits. If you've not had an audit recently in your community provider, you will have one in the near future. The National Disability Rights Movement, DRW, as one of its affiliates operating here in Wisconsin, has a top priority to find people receiving special minimum wage who aren't happy, and then to generate a complaint to the Department of Labor to spur an audit. And that's in writing. It's a fact. And most recently, NDRN engineered with Wage and Hour, who's under tremendous pressure, the folks that administer the 14C program and enforce it. They've been beaten up a lot too. Has resulted in a memorandum of understanding where Wage and Hour is saying, okay, NDRN and DRW and the other disability rights groups in the other states, we'll let you be a part of our enforcement effort, and we support the fact of you being able to go into a community organization and find people who are unhappy, and then telling us about it so we can come and audit. So that's a recent development, and that's something we definitely need to change. We all know about Department of Justice ADA compliance. The most recent news has been the Oregon approved settlement by the court. Basically, Oregon is going to go off in the same direction as Rhode Island and New York. But what's fundamentally different about this particular settlement is Oregon's adoption of a more rigorous effort to do the good thing, create more job opportunities and community capacity, but to more aggressively move to close down center-based options. And in our opinion, DOJ didn't command that. It's not the law, it's not the regulation, but for whatever reason, the Oregon administration decided to, in my opinion, cave in, and they gave more than they needed to. And we'll see how all that plays out. What I will say is when you read the fine print, Oregon reserves the right to change what it's accepted along the many-year route to getting to the final conclusion of making sure that 7,000 people with disabilities, half of them currently in a center-based employment situation, half coming out of the schools or in other environments, have a community job, supported employment job. But Oregon reserves the right due to funding constraints or other issues to modify that. And though I wish that we can have the most perfect world, the pragmatist in me, the experience that I've seen is it's going to take a long time before there are enough jobs and a business community that's able to support individuals whose needs are very, very intense. Behavioral issues, mobility issues, speed issues, transportation issues, medication, healthcare issues. It's going to be a long time before we create that new world. And we got to slow down the train so people don't keep getting hurt. People are getting hurt right now in the state of Washington, in the state of Maine, in New Hampshire. The states that are put out there as being the models and the leaders, some things that are happening that the public is not aware of, nor policymakers. WIOA, Link spoke to that. There are issues in the proposed regulations that we are fighting to change. The ACCSES committee, we got to work to tame this monster that was let loose because it started originally in the wrong direction to eliminate options and opportunities. We're going to be hearing from the chairman, David Mank, at our summit in New Orleans later in the month. So we were very definitely engaged in that activity. And through ACCESS and through RFW, there are opportunities to submit public comment. We, in fact, arranged for a panel to present live and in person at the last meeting of this committee of individuals and parents who, oh, by the way, we like having options and opportunities. And you need to hear from us, too, the other side. So we're fully engaged there. ACCBS rules. Two things. States have to have flexibility, and the full array of options need to be executed, implemented, administered in state plans. Those are the two key goals that we have. We got state flexibility. We made sure that happened in the ACCBS regs. But now at the state level, we got to make sure that we preserve options and opportunities where they're needed and wanted. And the procurement programs, Ability One at the national level, state use programs at the state level, under tremendous pressure to change. And some of this is that competition I was talking about earlier. And again, the media sword has been used mightily by the proponents of impacting, reducing, if not eliminating, these programs that help market goods and services produced by people with disabilities. So that's under tremendous threat. So we got to act together and make sure that the directions and the outcomes of change are produced in a good way. We got to do our outcome research. What is actually happening when options are eliminated? Federal government is paying for millions and millions and millions of dollars of research saying this one option is the best and only option, and we got to close down these other options. The research that says, oh yeah, I don't really think that's what's going on the ground, is not there. We got a taste of it, though, when Washington State audited its own IDD program. And what did we find out? That people had lost jobs and had lost income when they went to a very strict and formal employment first program, where people were actually, where they were working and occupied 30 to 40 hours a week, maybe making special minimum wage, maybe not, maybe making well above. When those programs got shut down, you went into employment first, you're working 4 hours a week now if you're lucky at minimum wage. And the gross revenue has been severely impacted. Oh, and by the way, if you're in the employment first track, you don't get to go to a day program. You get to go back and be with mom and dad if you have one. But you don't get other rehabilitation services. So this all or nothing. But Washington is put out as a premier model in employment at its best. In Maine, we have had a report recently released that we published, which said the same thing. When you eliminate options, you eliminate jobs, and you eliminate services. And what we need to find out, well, okay, what happens to mom and dad? Did they divorce? Did one of them have to go leave their job in a two-person income family because now they're a full-time daycare provider? What happened to the health status of Sue and Jimmy now that they don't want to wake up every morning and go to a job that they love, and now they're sitting at home eating potato chips in front of the TV? What's happening to their health status? And what's that going to cost community and society when they're starting to go to the emergency rooms in intensive, et cetera, et cetera? Somebody's got to do it, and we got to initiate it as a community. Better job of public relations and education we need to do. Educating policymakers, media engagement, we got to fight back through the media. We got to continue to advocate on policy issues, local, state, and federal level. We got to keep our officials honest, making sure that they're executing the law, not changing policy through the executive branch. And we got to lobby for policy change where we think it's needed to strengthen the system, not to change it. And we got to sue if we got to sue. Nobody wants to sue. But when you look back at the history of disability services, when did major changes in progressive policy occur? Court orders, judgments by the court, judgments by the Supreme Court. So we have a history of litigation when needed as last resort. At our summit in New Orleans, we're going to be looking at how can we impact Medicaid rates for people with the most intensive needs who need those services, but without those services would be in more expensive services, emergency rooms, back in public institutions. That is a real big need. We need to look at more creative ways, and the third branch of government, perhaps. We have great opportunities to work with our elected officials and educate them and to support them. When it's time for them to get some support, when they're up for election, not as not-for-profits or representing not-for-profits, but as individual citizens. I believe we all have the duty and obligation of electing officials to represent us and helping them get those offices. And there are a whole variety of ways that we can do that as citizens, and you know the ways. We got to continue to build community support with our chambers of commerce, our Kiwanis clubs, our Rotary clubs. We got to become part of our community in that regard. WIOA has some great new revenue opportunities and new services that we can provide as we shape it to be a positive force, as well as ACBS. So we got to look at where are the opportunities in some of these things which are also threats. And the A-Teams Wisconsin. Wisconsin is top tier in terms of all these things that we're talking about we need to do more of. We put Wisconsin out as the model and the leader. So when Op Inc., Barb LeDuc, Robin started to tell us about A-Teams, and RFW kind of sponsored the statewide movement here in Wisconsin, we saw the impact, the outcomes of that. We said we got to do this somehow, some way on more of a national scope. So A-Teams Wisconsin, way to go, threshold. Good stuff. We got to do more of it. And there are organizations here to help. RFW Access. We're trying to build information and mechanisms and tools to unify us, common message, get the word out. And there is a paddle store nearby, even when you're in the creek. So grassroots advocacy, what matters most is what ACCESS is branded as a way to help get information out, get individuals and families and communities involved and their supporters. So I want to run through these slides. John will have a copy of this if anybody wants the set. He has it here on his machine. He could share it. But basically, again, this is to energize individuals, families, communities on a single message. It's pretty simple. One size does not fit all, and we got to have options and opportunities. And the citizens need to have the voice. Your local and state representatives don't listen, nor do your federal representatives listen to a lobby firm, a lobby organization in D.C. I mean, you know, we work to develop relationships, et cetera. But when they hear from their constituents, we really act more as a go-to, because we're close by, to help fill in the blanks and give more information and, you know, help support the education effort. But you all on the ground are the ones that they really listen to, because you're the voters. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And here's some individuals that are out there speaking for themselves. So the A-Team is here, Barb and Robin, RFW. So A-Teams, Wisconsin, you've got a way to plug in. I'm sure you already are plugged in. What matters most, if you want more of a national flavor, or actually together, it's a much more robust, interactive group. Here are the players so far in the states, and Barb and Robin were telling me that SUPRA, which represents state use organizations, has recently come into agreement to get A-Teams moving through the state use system, which operates in about 22 states, or they have affiliates in 22 states. So we get some more of a national flavor coming up soon. So they're popping up, and Barb and Robin had a lot to do with these activities in these states, are getting active in local, state, grassroots, and plugging into a national common message. Changing the media landscape. I mentioned that earlier and why it's important, and we've made progress. Here's a good news story. These are the numbers of stories over a 2-year period that were published on disability rights, almost 35,000. Sheltered workshops were mentioned almost 3,300 times. most of them negative stories, if not all. And we began to see, because of our mutual efforts, a turnaround in the message and tone since we began to engage actively at 2012. So first you have the NBC Rock Center report, special minimum wage, center-based employment, terrible, exploitive, hurting the people. I did maybe 2 hours of off and on the record education of the producers and reporters for this story, and they quote me as saying what they said I said. And then by 2 years later, we have another great media outlet, Bloomberg, also based in New York, come out and have a total different way of presenting the story, which now includes the other side. And through all of our mutual efforts, we steer people to talk to the individuals and the families and go visit a community organization, visit an employment program, see what really is going on. So over a 2-year period, we are shifting the conversation in media. And there's lots of good evidence here in actual media that if you're interested, you can and should consume with these slides. I'm not going to go over them in detail. But we now have articles ending in a way that's suggesting, well, maybe we ought to move a little more slowly, and maybe people really like this and we ought not to close it down. There's a shift in tone. These are good programs. It's okay for people who want to live and work in community. We all support that. But other options ought to be available for people. We're getting more traction on some of the stresses and challenges that we face as an industry. Get more publicity on that, which is more supportive. Instead of the bashing, we're now getting more support in the media for what we do. The concerns that are being raised by individuals and families about, hey, what are you trying to do, take away my job? What are you trying to do? My son, daughter has had 5 community jobs, but if not for the threshold, I would have had no place to go. They saved my life. You can't shut them down. People are telling their own stories. Talks about the benefits of center-based employment, not only for the individual workers, but for local businesses. They now have a labor resource. They have some cost-cutting opportunities where they don't have to hire on site, and they can manage up and down workflow by partnering with community organizations. This is good business news and community news story. Letters to the editor are being published from family members. We're talking about the local chambers of commerce, Kiwanis clubs that are supporting. This is a screenshot of a video, part of our messaging campaign, produced by Aspiro. I presented at Aspiro this morning. Didn't have time to get one from John, but I'm sure the Threshold has its own arsenal of stories. But telling the story is so critical. And Aspiro a couple of years ago, and ACCSES provided some support to the script, to make sure the right policy words were being used and that kind of stuff. So we had the opportunity to partner a little bit on this. But it's a great discussion of what commensurate wage really is and how it works. And then we have a video that we want to show. Do I have enough time?
How long is the video? We got about 10 minutes?
10 minutes, yes, we have time. This is going to be the close. Again, part of the work that we do is try to stimulate and support. We have some relationships with public relations groups. So whenever somebody is inclined to produce a video or videos to throw into the mix, or to present as public testimony to the ACI EIDIO committee. We'll help support that. So the Arnold Center in Michigan just put this on the streets, and we wanted to share it with you.
Nearly every day for 26 years, Eric Strack has had a reason to get up and get out the door. His job. Eric works at the Arnold Center in Midland, Michigan, a nonprofit organization that provides jobs for disabled workers. Alex Strack is Eric's mother.
If he didn't have the Arnold Center to come to, he'd be home, and he would be devastated.
Eric has Down syndrome and communicates through facial expression. Often he does jobs like this, assembling kits. Local companies hire the Arnold Center to do such work, and people like Eric are the beneficiaries.
The Arnold Center is a social place. They have their friends. They have a great deal of pride in what they are accomplishing, and the pride comes out when he sees his paycheck.
Paychecks which Eric and his co-workers are happy to show off.
I got $180.
The money may not seem like much, but many of the workers are eligible for government assistance like Social Security, housing, and Medicaid. People here want to work, and the Arnold Center provides stable employment.
We have an individual person-centered plan for each of our individuals that we serve, so we know exactly what their capabilities are, what their wants and needs are, and where they might fit better, and then we align those skills and abilities and desires with the work that we are given.
But the work is under siege.
Those workers are legally exempt from minimum wage protection.
The media and some advocacy groups have criticized sheltered workshops for pay and work conditions. The Arnold Center pays most of its workers at piece rate, determined by a U.S. Labor Department formula. Workers typically clock 6 hours a day, and their paycheck varies based on their productivity. The companies don't contract with the Arnold Center because it's a charity.
We have to have a business proposition, a value proposition that fits within the competitive environment that they're operating in. If we don't make enough money to cover our expenses and put some money in for depreciation and new programming, we will go out of business.
In addition to eliminating minimum wage waivers, government regulators are trying to create so-called integrated work settings. The Arnold Center would have to employ higher-priced, non-disabled workers to work alongside those who are disabled. To pay for that, the Arnold Center would have to fire a number of its disabled workers.
That just doesn't make sense to me.
Finding work in the community is not so simple for the disabled. Jacob Balseric is 27 years old, and before landing at the Arnold Center, he went through 4 jobs.
Sometimes he functions as a normal 27-year-old, and then other times it's more around the level of a 7-year-old.
Employers would give him more responsibility than he could handle. He wouldn't do parts of his job.
His supervisor just said that nobody had the time to babysit him.
His underperformance caused a rift. His coworkers threatened to beat him up. And then the most heartbreaking moment.
I think he was fired 3 days before he kept going back to work. And finally his supervisor contacted his school caseworker, and she contacted me, because he came home and said, well, the person said this to me, what do you think that means? And he's seen it as a failure. He went through a period of depression because, again, he's failed again and doesn't understand why, this is happening.
The Arnold Center gives Jacob more control over his hours and his responsibilities. When he wants to earn more money, he'll work at the center's public auctions of donated household goods.
Certainly, everybody ought to have a crack at integrated community employment at minimum wage or better. But if that doesn't work out, what's the best next step?
For these workers, it's having a choice, like the Arnold Center. But some groups feel otherwise. The Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council and the ARC of Michigan declined to talk on camera, but the council directed us to their report making the case against places like the Arnold Center. They captured their position with 2 sentences, 48 words each.
The Arnold Center already has to follow a number of rules and regulations. Once a year, they have to produce a number of documents for accreditation, and they fill all of these tables.
Alice Strack hopes the Arnold Center doesn't go out of business. especially for the day when she's not there for her son.
Well, I do worry about that because I am not a spring chicken.
Eric now lives in his own apartment with a roommate and some support. Steady work gives him structure and purpose.
And he's happy. And that's what you want, as a mother wants her kids to be happy.
Okay, if you want, oh, we're not back up. There we go. First of all, RFW, the Threshold, other members of RFW have been great supporters of the Access Champions campaign. They've enabled us to do a better job of getting the word out and making an impact with policymakers. Access.org is being engineered as an open source website. So all the stuff that we produce and post will be available. And we hope that it gets the job done, most importantly, but two, that it will allow for Access to be recognized as a resource and we can gain more, frankly, more support from around the nation to help us do better things on your behalf. You can find this video, the Aspiro video. I don't know, John, if we posted any of your information yet, but we have on the access.org and the whatmattersmostcampaign.org sites, there are links to Facebook where there are videos that you can use in education. You can use them for ideas. Some of them have been canned to be used universally, so it doesn't matter what organization that you're affiliated with. It's really a national generic piece that tells the story. We have a summit in January. We're going to be talking about litigation. We have David Mank, the chairman of the EIEIO committee that we're tracking, is going to be there to speak with us. And then we have an annual conference in D.C. July 10th through 13th, which is a great time to meet the folks from the Hill, representatives, senators, staff of the key committees with oversight in the areas that we care about in public policy. So you get one-on-one, face-to-face interaction with those folks. And I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts. Zig Ziglar, logic will not change an emotion, but action will. And Gregory Peck, tough times don't last, tough people do. How many in this room are tough? Yeah! Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry and Link. We said we'd be done at 1:30. We are. We have some of our elected officials here, and I'm sure the fog is clearing. They will welcome if you want to come up and talk to them. If you want to, whatever your issues are, feel free to come up and talk to them. But we want to get everybody out of here at 1:30, so thank you for coming. Next year we'll put this back as a legislative breakfast. Seems to work a little bit better, but thank you for coming and have a safe trip home. And come up and talk to our folks.
Okay.